Okay, so today's lesson is all about classifying polygons. So last lesson we talked about what a polygon is. We know a polygon is made up of straight lines, that there can be no curve. A polygon cannot have any intersecting lines, and a polygon has to be a closed figure, so there can't be any gaps. So now that we know what a polygon is, we're going to start talking about how we can classify polygons based on their sides. So what we did a few weeks ago, I think it was before spring break, is going to be super important. We cannot forget parallel and perpendicular lines. So we know that parallel lines are lines that run forever and ever and ever on end, and they will never, ever, ever, ever touch. So they can be like this, because if these lines kept going, they're never going to touch. They can be like this, because if they keep going, they're never going to touch. They can be like this, because if they keep going, they're never going to touch. Parallel lines cannot touch. So sometimes when you see these polygons, you are going to have to imagine and maybe even draw, like with your finger, draw the lines up. And if your fingers ever touch, they're not parallel. So parallel lines never, ever, ever, ever touch. Perpendicular lines are going to intersect, but they only intersect at 90-degree angles. So perpendicular lines are like this. Think of the shape of, I can't tell on the computer which one looks like an L to you. Think of the shape of an L. It'd be like you could put a square in the corner, a 90-degree right angle. Think about what we did with right triangles. So perpendicular lines cross at 90 degrees. So like if these lines crossed, we cross at 90 degrees. If these lines cross, that's going to be 90 degrees. If they cross like this, it's going to be 90 degrees. But if lines cross like this, that intersection angle where they intersect right there, that's not 90 degrees. So those would not be perpendicular. We'll talk about that, and we're going to do some examples. The examples I'm getting ready to show you are actually all the ones from your lesson. So if you want to, as we go through them, we're going to talk about the number of parallel lines and the number of perpendicular lines for each shape. These are coming directly from your lesson. It's also super important to know when we're going to talk about sets of lines. Think of how many sets and pairs. How many does it take to make a pair? You're a pair of shoes. Is that one shoe or is that two shoes? It's two shoes. But two shoes is just one pair. Gets a little tricky because a lot of times when people see these, they want to say that's two pairs of parallel lines. But it takes two to make one pair. So if you see two parallel lines, that is just one pair. And I'll explain that as we go on. So as we're going through it, I'm going to drop the marker. The purple marker is going to be parallel lines, and the blue marker is going to help us find perpendicular lines. So here is our first shape. All of these that we're looking at today are quadrilaterals, which means they have 4 sides and 4 angles. So here is the shape we're looking at today, the first one. So this shape, we want to look for parallel lines. So if I think about, and it's going to be opposite pairs, which makes it's pretty easy to look at with quadrilaterals because there's only 4. So I'm going to look at opposite pairs. So I'm going to think about this line and this line. Well, goodness, look, that line is slanted down. So you know if that line keeps going and that line keeps going, they're definitely going to intersect. And they're going to intersect. They would even intersect on this paper. So they're not parallel. But what about these two? These two, if they kept going forever and ever and ever, they're not going to touch. So at most you could have 2 pairs of parallel lines. For this one though, we have 1 pair of parallel lines. So we have 1 pair of parallel lines. Now we need to look at perpendicular lines. So we're going to look where lines intersect. So these lines intersect, but they do not form a right angle. They do not form a perfect square. We couldn't put a perfect square right in there. So those aren't perpendicular. These two, they do not intersect to form a right angle. But look at these two. I could draw a perfect square in that corner. So here is one set of parallel lines, or perpendicular lines, I'm sorry. And over here I could do the same thing. I could draw a perfect square in that corner. So this shape has 1, 2 pairs of perpendicular lines. 1 pair of parallel, 2 pairs of perpendicular. This shape has, you should be able to look at this pretty easily and think, okay, these two definitely going to intersect. Definitely going to intersect. All of these lines are intersecting. So there are 0 pairs of parallel lines. And then I don't see any places where these meet that I could put a perfect square. So there are also 0 pairs of perpendicular lines there. I could not make a perfect square in any of those angles. Now our next shape, we're going to have more to work with. So this is a rectangle. So if I'm thinking about parallel lines, look at these sides. So we're going to look at opposite sides. These sides can go on and on and on forever. So these sides are going to be parallel. I'm going to draw an arrow there. So there's one set, but then also look at this set of opposite sides. These sides can go on and on and on forever. So I'm going to draw 2 arrows there to show that it's different. So here I have, this is one set, one pair of parallel lines. This is another pair of parallel lines. So this rectangle and all rectangles have 2 pairs of parallel lines. Let's look at pairs of perpendicular sides. So in all of those corners, it looks like I could put a square. It looks like, yep, those lines are perpendicular. Those lines are perpendicular. Those lines are perpendicular. And those lines are perpendicular. So for this one, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pairs of perpendicular lines. Because I can look and I see 4 perfect square corners there. So a rectangle, doesn't matter if the rectangle is vertical like this or if we turned it horizontal, a rectangle has 2 pairs of parallel sides and has 4 perpendicular sides. Now we have this shape. So if I want to go ahead and look, it's pretty easy. Perpendicular is a lot easier to tell than parallel because look, do I have any perfect square corners? No. So I already know there's 0 pairs of perpendicular sides. But parallel, here's where it gets a little trickier. If I look at the, remember, opposite sides, so this side and this side, if those keep going on forever and ever and ever, they're going to run side by side forever, but they're never going to touch. So here's one set of parallel lines, but then look, if I go to the opposite pair, those can go on and on and on and on forever, and they're never going to touch. So this is going to have 2 pairs of parallel lines. We're going to do 1 more, 2 more, just kidding. We're going to do 2 more. So this is a trapezoid. So first thing we're going to look at, we're going to look for perpendicular lines. I don't see any. I do not see in any of these 4 angles, none of them are 90-degree right angles. So there are 0 pairs of perpendicular lines. But now let's look for our parallel lines. So if I look at this set of opposite lines, no, they're going to touch. They're going to touch right up here and make almost a triangle. But if I look at this set of opposite lines, they're going to run side by side forever and they're never going to touch. So there is one pair of parallel lines on this trapezoid. Now the last one we're going to look at is a funky shape. It's a funky quadrilateral. We're going to look first for a perpendicular. We're going to look for a right angle, see if we can find any. So if I look here, this is definitely not a right angle. This is definitely not a right angle. This is definitely not a right angle. But right here is a right angle. So I have one pair of perpendicular lines. But now let's start looking for my parallel lines. So I'm going to look at opposites. This line and this line. Well, they're not going to touch in this direction. But if I continue them in this direction, they'll surely touch. And this line, they would touch right about up here if my lines kept going. So there are 0 pairs of parallel lines, but there is one pair of perpendicular lines. So we have just gone through about half of the ones on your lesson. The other half are very similar, so think through it. Parallel lines, they're going to go on and on and on forever and never touch, and you're going to look for opposite sides. Perpendicular lines, you're going to look and see how many perfect square, perfect right angles you can find.